put a pilot project into school called outcomes-based education. And we were one of 10 pilot schools across the state. And what I found first was that we were a pilot school, although it had already been mandated. That made no sense that we would have a law mandating that every school in the state would do this, but our school was pilot. So in other words, an experiment, trying it out. And I found out that is very much the way this operates. We have things that get started, put in place with good intentions. People usually do not know what is developing down the road. So I learned to start looking down the road. Later on, as I saw what this was, I began to speak up on the committee, and one, maybe two people at times, but usually me and one other person were the objectors. And our statements that we were developing, the mission statement, vision statement, said that our students would be prepared for the 21st century, that they would be prepared for global citizenship. There were things that were not traditional education, and they were not defined. That's what bothered me the most. What does this mean? We had a man come from the State Department of Education that told us that outcomes-based education was what students know, will do, and what they will be like. When he said what they will be like, I knew that as an educator, we're getting into an area that is called the affective domain, the emotions, feelings, attitudes, values, and beliefs. But long story short, I ended up doing speaking across the state. I'd done quite a bit of public speaking at that time in my field of expertise, working with vision and learning development in a private practice after I had taught public school. But as I said, I was on a committee at this point as a parent. I started speaking to PTAs, teachers' meetings, town halls. The first meeting I held as a Republican, I was asked by a Democrat union negotiator who worked for the Pacific Railroad to have a town hall meeting and tell people what this was in our little community where I lived. So it started out very much a grassroots, bipartisan quest for what in the heck is going on in our community. We're a pilot school. We did end up rejecting the pilot for our local school. As we had parents become informed, I held meetings. I spoke then in other communities. People started calling me across the state. This developed into a statewide race for state superintendent of schools in 1994. I got 49.5% of the vote statewide. Then Governor Keating appointed me Secretary of Education for the state of Oklahoma. I went into his office, into his cabinet. But 3 months later, the confirmation in the Senate Ed Committee, 12 Democrats, 5 Republicans, straight party line vote, the Democrats would not approve my appointment. But he kept me as education advisor into the National Governors Association meeting for education advisors in 1995. And there I met a man named Mark Tucker, whom I had read his writing. He is one that works with Hillary Clinton then and now from the National Center for Education and the Economy. Mark Tucker wrote that we will have cradle-to-grave services and training for children throughout life. There will be tracking with their data in computer bases. And in 1994, as we all know, the computer systems were not nearly as well developed as what we have today. So today we have the state longitudinal data system that each state has with their stimulus money. From Governor Keating's office, where I stayed for a year, at the end of the year, I elected to go. I chose to go at the request of the Commissioner of Labor over to the Department of Labor, where she appointed me as Deputy Commissioner of Labor for the state over workforce education and training. And from there, I did an analysis report with an assistant, an analysis report on the school-to-work system and how that would affect education, training, and the workforce in the state of Oklahoma. And we could spend the whole time talking about that, but the bottom line is It's very much what we have today in what is called America Works. Oklahoma's governor, where I am now, Oklahoma's Governor Mary Fallin, was the chairman of the National Governors Association in 2013 to 2014, where she initiated the America Works initiative, which is school to work. So we have all of the Workforce Investment Act, and of course all of this was going on from the time of Clinton's forward. This is just the new rollout through the Governors Association. So I am very much about looking at things closely. We must look at the details, and the details in this federal legislation that we'll be talking about tonight. And as Alice said, I very much agree. It is not about bashing anyone, but we are in America, and we must speak, and we must do our research ahead of time and not regret what happens down the road.
And that's what I think is so key to understanding all of this, because as my history of kind of coming into this and working from the grassroots and working very hard to get people like Ted Cruz elected to the U.S. Senate, and there's other conservative Republicans in the state of Texas that I worked very hard to get elected. But when I started asking the questions on education about specific legislation, that's when and I'm not talking about Ted Cruz necessarily, I'm talking about across the board, that's when I became ostracized. And
yes.
one of the issues that I kept looking at was this legislation. In Texas, we said no to the Common Core National Standards, but why was all of this coming into our state when we said no? And it's so interesting that it's the issue of school choice seemed to always be the dividing line. And before we get into Senate Bill 306, I want to have each of you talk about the school choice issue, because one thing, Karen, that you said, you have to look at legislation and you have to look at funding. And the funding for the school choice movement is so massive. And the narrative of school choice is so well funded. And what's interesting is that it's funded in large part by Bush's organization, Jeb Bush's organization, who was for the Common Core. But yet I have, conservative legislators where I'm going to town halls and they're bringing in people from Jeb Bush's organization as the experts on education. And these are the same people that said no to the Common Core. So Karen, can you start first? And then Linda, I want to get your take. But give us a little history about why it is so hard. If you come out against school choice, you've got a target on your back. Am I correct on that?
Oh, absolutely. And I think part of it is because the reformers, which are nonpartisan for the most part, have a specific goal. They're looking for a new type of education system that is seamless from cradle to career, built on portable, stackable credentials for career pathways. And so they know the end game. What they do very well, very cleverly, is they frame the argument in narratives that make it palatable to whoever is listening that needs to be convinced. So for a Republican, they talk about choice and free markets and competition. But yet when I talk to a Republican on the choice issue and I say, explain to me how the state competing with itself is competition. They control the funding, therefore they get to pick the winner and the loser. That's not competition, that's cannibalization. So they're creating a choice scenario, funding them both, starting to drain the funding in one, continue to fund the other, well, then you know who's going to win and who's going to lose. So it's very hard to come against choice because you look like you're coming against competition. You're coming against vocabulary, but you're not coming against truth. And that's the problem. So when you present the choice argument to a legislature, I would be foolish to say I'm anti-choice. But really what I'm anti is what they define as choice. Their definition of choice is not what you and I hear. So we hear something like school choice, and we think that means that we are truly going to get a choice. No, it really doesn't mean that. And if you look at schools like the Detroit Public Schools or in New Orleans, where there is no choice, and in fact, I believe it was either our governor or our state superintendent who said there are too many choices in Detroit now. We need to start limiting them. And when you look at some of the people who are behind it, like the Jeb Bush Foundation, back in when they were promoting it in Florida, they were making kids choose their career majors by the 8th, no later than the 9th grade, and Jobs for the Future, which is another one that is promoting this, and the credentialing behind it. Here's a quote from them. The U.S. education system at the secondary level is driven by individual states and local districts, making it more difficult to establish a nationwide system of credentialing. That is what is in place in other countries where education is often managed and run at the federal level. So they're basically telling you in the fine print of their PDFs, which few politicians read, but we do, the definition of what they mean by choice. And so we have a target on our back because these people have run on school choice, and we're telling them, but that's not the definition, and now they're in a conundrum. And that's what I'm sympathetic to Ted Cruz and some of the others, because they've bought into an idea they thought they believed in, but what they're finding out is the people who, like Linda and I and you, who read the PDFs are saying, but that's not what it means. Intellectual honesty says, I'm now faced with a decision. Do I go with what the facts say in these documentation, or do I go with what the lobbyists are telling me, what the donors are telling me, what the think tanks are telling me that is necessary? And that's a real choice. That's the choice before the politicians, and it's a hard choice. It takes courage to go up against donors. It takes courage to stand up for the Constitution when your fellow legislator is saying, wait a minute, you're coming against school choice? That's political suicide. And it is. And that's why we have a target on our back, because as long as everybody keeps quiet and nobody exposes the true definition and the lie, then everybody can keep pretending until it's too late. And my idea is you defeat, don't repeal. And we've lost too many arguments, too many campaigns. Common Core was in place, and we got 45 states in because nobody wanted to believe what was really happening. And now that they see it, we're all trying to repeal it. Well, let's defeat the idea, not just the bill. And to do that takes courage. And yeah, those first one of us, we're going to take a lot of hits. I take none of it personally, and it's unfortunate that they don't want to engage in the argument, but it also is very, very telling because it says that they really don't have a strong argument.
That's right. Linda, I want to get your take.
Well, very much I agree with what Karen has said. Certainly another aspect to it is the think tanks, the conservative organizations and groups that have bought into the concepts. Milton Friedman's free enterprise, competition, builds excellence, all of these statements that we know are true in business. And yet, when it's applied to a public school system with choice and the dismantling of the public schools that is going on and the unfair comparisons with schools that have private schools that have no regulation in certain areas that public schools do have, they have more control over who they admit and who they keep in their school. There are all kinds of things that are being done that are totally destructive to a public school system that our parents, our grandparents, really paid into, helped to build, while our local school boards are being removed in the situation where private schools and charter schools are brought in. That is losing representation and the voice of the parent and the community. So there are a lot of aspects to this that happen when you buy into the idea that public education is so horrible and so destroyed that we've got to replace it with choice, and here you have all of these choices. But as Karen said, we find that when you get into the details and the regulations that are written in